House of the Dragon is finally here. We have been worried, we have been skeptical, we have tried to manage expectations, we have been excited, but here we are, and man did I miss this. I don't know about you, but I went through an emotional roller coaster leading up to this premiere because, as longtime viewers of my channel already know, Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire combined are my main fandom. It's the only fandom I've been thoroughly invested in reading, watching, theorizing, listening to multiple podcasts, you name it. It's a huge part of why this channel even exists. The first video I uploaded was about season 4 of Game of Thrones, and for years after that, I did episode recaps. But considering how Game of Thrones wrapped up, I do have a video on that finale if you're curious about my feelings. But considering all that, just like many of you, I'm sure, I was afraid to get really excited for this prequel. I eventually did because the trailers were just too much fun, but I was still definitely nervous going into it. Now, after watching episode 1, The Heirs of the Dragon, I am pretty happy. Here's how this video is going to work. I'm going to briefly talk about the prologue that opens the episode, as well as the setup that we've seen so far. Then I'm going to talk about what I liked the most, as well as what I'm hoping to see as far as the rest of the season goes. And after that, finally, I will get into some of the questions that you submitted. So let's talk about House of the Dragon and finally be excited about Westeros again. The series is based on Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, which is not a novel, it's a Targaryen history book. The good thing about this is that it's a complete story that exists and the showrunners have a solid framework to work with. George R.R. Martin also seems to be majorly involved with the series, and everyone has been promising that this will be very close to the source material, which is great. On the other hand, because this is a history book and not a novel, there's a lot of writing that needs to be done to flesh out these characters and fill in the blanks. They have some brief he said, she said quotes they can use from the book, but there aren't really any iconic character exchanges or monologues for them to work with. So this series is a big writing challenge as far as whether or not they can match how layered and interesting the characters and their interactions were for the majority of Game of Thrones, as those were based on George R.R. Martin's novels. And by the way, it is impossible not to compare the two. First of all, because they are both set in the same fantasy world, but also because this series doesn't really have a lot of interest in separating themselves from Game of Thrones. If anything, they seem to be interested in reigniting that passion in existing fans. There are plenty of connections and Easter eggs for fans of Game of Thrones and the books in here, and the show in general is expanding the world and the lore rather than starting over. That being said, if you were to jump into this without watching Game of Thrones, I don't think you would have any issues understanding what's going on. The story is set almost 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones, and the focus is on completely different characters, so I am confident it will work as a standalone. The episode opens with a prologue, which was a smart way to go about this. It plants the viewers into the basic setup of the show. There's a ruling family, House Targaryen, and their kingdom has been going through a lengthy, peaceful time. But as George R.R. Martin puts it in the book, the seeds of war are oft planted during times of peace. What we're setting up for here is a civil war referred to as the Dance of the Dragons, which is of course fought over the Iron Throne of Westeros. Always the Iron Throne. It all becomes a mess because of the question of succession, whether or not a queen can be the ruler or the tradition of the male king must prevail. Now, the previous king actually called upon this council, which we see in the prologue, the Great Council of 101, to decide who should be the next ruler, and they specifically mentioned that he did this in order to prevent the war over succession. I love that they included this part of the book. The one they chose is Viserys Targaryen, who is the current king at the beginning of the show. He was chosen over Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, who was the other frontrunner with a potentially stronger claim, except that she is a woman. She is now referred to as the Queen Who Never Was. Now, 9 years into Viserys' reign, the issue of succession is once again looming as the king does not have a male heir. After his wife dies during a brutal childbirth scene, the choice is between his brother, Daemon, and his daughter, Rhaenyra. By the end of the episode, we know Viserys names Rhaenyra as his heir. As I mentioned in the beginning, I am pretty happy with this pilot episode. Even though there are some things I hope they improve on, there is a lot I loved about the Heirs of the Dragon. First of all, the overall setup, including the opening prologue, is done very well. This is something that stood out even more to me when I watched the episode for the second time. Not only do they do a great job setting up the historical context and the basic inner workings of this monarchy, grounding the audience in this world, but there are also very concise and effective ways in which they set up the characters and their relationships. You can pretty quickly figure out the tensions and the friendships, as well as get the general idea about the personalities of the main players. You get some lovely small council scenes where you not only figure out who is who, but also start getting into the politics of it all and who's likely to be on whose side. You see that Viserys is generally a nice guy, but maybe not the strongest decision maker, and relies heavily on his advisors who potentially take advantage of that, having their own agendas in mind, something that Daemon points out towards the end of the episode. You meet his daughter, Rhaenyra, who wants to ride her dragon and eat cake without much interest in the politics of the realm. She's a free spirit reminiscent of Arya Stark. You meet her friend, Alicent Hightower, who is a lot more conscious of her surroundings and expectations, and Alicent's father, Otto, the Hand of the King, who feels increasingly more scheming as the episode goes on, willing to use his daughter as a pawn to achieve his goals. And of course, there is Daemon Targaryen in his fabulous Legolas wig, the king's brother, the rogue prince. He's charismatic, entitled, overly confident, one who enjoys brutally enforcing the law a little bit too much, and whose softer side is only occasionally seen at the moment, mostly in his interactions with Rhaenyra. He is definitely the Jaime Lannister of this group. And by the way, all of them are morally great characters. That's the fun of it. We don't know them too well yet, so you might think that some things are clear-cut, some characters are good or bad. Give them some time. Things get even more interesting. Second, aside from the prologue, there are 3 major scenes that are essential to the story, and all of them work really well. This isn't to say that there's filler in this episode. I think they used their time really well, and everything seems to be setting up something important, but these 3 scenes are specifically something that needed to work in order for the story to be set up properly. The tournament that happens at the same time as the queen goes into labor, the argument between King Viserys and Daemon Targaryen, and the conversation between Viserys and Princess Rhaenyra as he names her his heir. The tournament and the birth scene are absolutely brutal, but also there is a lot to pay attention to here. Lots of familiar banners and sigils, lots of quick exchanges that hint at rising tensions, and the stark juxtaposition of a woman in labor trying to bring life into the world and men plaguing at war, some dying during this tournament. This waste of life was really striking to me. This unnecessary violence contrasted with how brutal it can be to birth a new life. The medieval C-section was particularly horrific. But as Princess Rhaenys points out, these nights are as green as summer grass. None have known a real war, perfectly illustrating how removed all these people are from actual conflict and how much they don't know what's coming for them. Later in the episode, there is the confrontation between Daemon and Viserys over what Daemon allegedly said about the king's dead son. It's a great scene from the dialogue and the character standpoint, and I love that some of the most honest words about the state of this monarchy are spoken by Daemon, currently one of the most unlikable characters of the show. But Viserys is very upset by Daemon's behavior and still grieving, so he makes the decision to name Rhaenyra as his heir. The scene between the king and Rhaenyra was definitely one of my favorites as well. It's set in front of a giant skull of Balerion the Black Dread, the only dragon Viserys rode, and a very important dragon to the Targaryens, one that Aegon the Conqueror rode. This conversation is cross-cut with the Lords of the Realm pledging fealty to King Viserys and his named heir, the princess. It's also where we get a surprising tie-in with A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones in the form of a regal secret that's been passed along for generations, a dream Aegon had about the end of the world that starts with the Great Winter. We all know what that means. Now, I know a lot of people didn't feel great about this tie-in, but I think it mostly comes from the dislike of the Game of Thrones finale. We don't want to be reminded of it. In concept, though, the tie-in works, and the prophetic dreams, in this case, dragon dreams, are a big part of the lore. Targaryens, before they conquered Westeros, got out of Valyria right before the Doom because of a dream. So having this prophetic dream be passed along as a regal secret is pretty fitting. Plus, supposedly this was added with George R. R. Martin's blessing, so there may just be things we aren't aware of yet. Finally, from the visual standpoint, it's a beautifully made show. Some of the early marketing looked a little too grim to me, as if they forgot that colors exist, but thankfully there are plenty of colors and textures going on top of some really beautiful, striking shots. I mean, after the prologue, the actual story opens with Princess Rhaenyra flying around on her dragon, set to Ramin Djawadi's epic score. It looks amazing, and you know you're in for a treat when you see that. Speaking of the dragons, I want to give a separate shout out to whoever was responsible for the decision to make the dragons be more distinct this time around. This actually bothered me in Game of Thrones a little bit. Daenerys' dragons were supposed to be different colors, and that's how you tell them apart, but in reality, the difference was so subtle, it was almost impossible to tell them apart. Here, we only meet 2 dragons so far, and we're definitely going to see quite a few more, but they are so easy to identify. Syrax is Rhaenyra's dragon, and she has yellow scales, and Caraxes, the bloodworm, is Daemon's red dragon. And it's not just the color that's distinguishable, they actually look slightly different the way they're designed if you look closely, which I really appreciated. Nerdy dragon things, I know, but just let me be happy, okay? As for what I hope to see for the rest of the season, the main things are more memorable dialogue and character scenes and more character complexity. I think as far as introducing the world and the characters goes, they did really well, but if they want people to stick around and to actually care about these characters, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. One of the biggest reasons why Game of Thrones was such a beloved show and why people had such strong reactions to the disappointing final seasons is because they cared for the characters. All of the major players were flawed and layered, each of them shaped by their background, their unique motivations and tactics. House of the Dragon definitely has the potential to get there, but it requires some serious writing work on their part, and I hope they can do it. Because yes, there are some standouts at the moment, and the conflict itself that we're building up to is going to be very interesting, but they need to back it up with character work. Someone like Daemon, who right now comes off as an obvious villain of the story, needs more complexity. Someone like Rhaenyra needs to have dimensions other than I'm a free spirit and I like cake. And that also goes for the dialogue itself. itself. Game of Thrones had some iconic dialogue, things that people quote to this day, scenes and monologues that gave people chills. I really hope this is something we can get from House of the Dragon as well, because I am rooting for the show. I want it to be amazing. Lastly, some of this brothel and graphic violence stuff was a bit ridiculous. Obviously, this is on brand for the series, and specifically having to do with Daemon Targaryen, it makes sense. In the book, he is sometimes referred to as Lord Fleabottom, but we need some better transitions here, because one minute people are talking in a room, and the next minute someone's butt is in your face, limbs are getting chopped off, or it's time for TNA. I am not saying take these things out, please keep them in. I'm just saying don't jump scare me with naked butts or unsexy sex. Also, no more traumatic birth scenes, please. I say this even though I know there are more coming up, but the one they showed in this episode was very, very brutal. I don't need that many details. Finally, the title sequence. We needed. What happened? All right, it's time to get into some of your questions. This video is going to be so long, but hopefully it's worth it. And by the way, if you want to ask questions about episode 2, keep an eye out for a community post on my YouTube page, and I will ask for your questions there after episode 2 airs. Speaking of the title sequence, what do you think of the lack of an opening title sequence? The original show had one of the most epic openings of all time. I agree. And this one had nothing. Okay, I was actually really thrown off by the lack of a title sequence. I kept waiting for it. I kept thinking, oh, I can't wait to see what they're gonna do. They have to step it up. They have to make it awesome. And then they just do the prologue and the Targaryen logo. And then we just go into the episode. But this is something I was hoping for. The prologue might have replaced the title sequence. So the rumor is, I've read this from a few reputable sources, so hopefully it's not just a rumor, that there will be a title sequence starting episode 2. And if there isn't, we riot. The obvious question, vaguely spoilery, blacks or greens? Come on. Come on. Blacks, of course. Unless the show convinces me otherwise, blacks. Yeah. By the way, if you're not familiar with what this means, if you're not familiar with the story, you haven't read the book or at least some Targaryen history articles, do not Google this. Don't do it. You will spoil yourself. Just let it go. You'll figure it out as the show goes on. But for those of you who know, yes, it's blacks. Please let me know in the comments if you're Team Blacks or Team Greens. So Viserys is a villain, right? Surely they don't expect us to rally behind him after what he did to his wife. So I've seen some angry opinions online about Viserys, and I'm not sure if people are just approaching it with the eye of the 21st century or if there was something people missed. But just to clarify, Viserys' choice was his wife and kid die in the birth because they tried turning the kid. They couldn't. The baby is breached. She's going to die in childbirth and the baby is going to die with her. Or they could try to save the baby. It's not a great choice that he had. So he could have let her suffer for X amount of hours, who knows how much longer, and just let her and the baby die naturally. Or he made the decision to try to save the child. The only thing I wish he did was kind of asked her how she feels about this, or at least notified her about what was going on, because it was pretty brutal the way she had no idea what was about to happen. But do I see him as a villain? No, absolutely not. This is an impossible choice that he was faced with, and I don't think choosing to let them both die and suffer, which they did both die in the end, but at least they tried to save one of them. She was unsavable. What a brutal scene. Oh my God. I assume that there's a night watch at Castle Black during this time also. Is it manned by disowned citizens of the realm, or is it a position of honor? I don't believe this is a position of honor at this point in history. The Night's Watch was formed like 8,000 years ago or something like this during the first long night. I'm not going to get into that. If you're curious, read about it. It was literally thousands of years ago. And back then, it was a position of honor. However, over the centuries, that position of honor became a place where criminals went to avoid their verdict. So they're given a choice: lose an arm or go to the Night's Watch. And I do believe that that's the state of the Night's Watch at the time of this series. So pretty similar to Game of Thrones. Do you think the show can stand on its own as a prequel? I think the opening with 172 years before Daenerys Targaryen and the dream about the Song of Ice and Fire are a little bit too much. And do you use a cheat sheet while watching about who is who and who's related? I do not use a cheat sheet because I am a huge nerd of this fantasy universe. So yeah, I am the cheat sheet. Oh my God. I do agree that 172 years before Daenerys Targaryen was pretty cheesy and very heavy-handed. I understand they're trying to do the whole thing of, look guys, remember that person you really liked? Well, these people are the ancestors, but we're also far removed, so don't expect to see the characters you know. However, I think the way they did it in the opening was a little bit too much. They need more subtlety if they're going to keep doing that. The Song of Ice and Fire dream I did address already earlier, so I do not mind that. I think it makes sense. And after watching the preview for episode 2, or was it the In the Coming Weeks trailer, one of those, they do talk about this prophecy again, and they talk about the prince that was promised. So it's clearly going to be part of the story and part of the motivation for at least something that goes on here, which I think is fine as long as they do it in a smart way and not just name drop the Long Night. I've had confidence in the show based on the fact that it's an adaptation of Fire and Blood. For me, the Game of Thrones seasons adapted from the books are excellent. It's when they went off script that things dropped in quality. Did you/do you feel the same way? And are you confident in this show going forward based on this fact? Yes and no. I am confident that they're not going to completely drop the ball on this one like they did with the final seasons of Game of Thrones. And at least there is a timeline that they're following that is going to be pretty equally paced, at least. I hope so, based on Fire and Blood. However, the dialogue and the writing that they took from George's novels in earlier seasons of Game of Thrones is a big part of why they were so good. They don't have that now. So as long as they can write all of that, as long as they can fill in the blanks, they will do a great job. I am very hopeful about the show, especially after the first episode. I think there's a lot of potential here. I think they started off really strongly. But here's the other thing. If you've read the book, you know that there are conflicting accounts of history when it comes to Fire and Blood. In Fire and Blood, for those of you who don't know, in this book, there are different people telling the story. And sometimes they know a certain thing happened, like this person left the castle and went on their merry way. But why they did that, there are conflicting accounts, and they can definitely choose some very lame and cheesy routes to get there, or they can side with a different side of the story and make it more interesting, or they could come up with their own way to interpret what happened, or they can blend them. There's definitely room for interpretation, and that's going to be really interesting to see. So there really isn't an expectation for a lot of things except for the major events of this happened, this person died, these people got married, this person backstabbed somebody. That we know. But the reasoning and how they got there, that's going to be interesting to see. There were a few times in the episode where there were oddly edited sequences that either cut off someone talking or left the outcome of the scene unclear. This was further exacerbated by the post-show interview where they stated some things around the birth in a very straightforward way that did not seem so in the episode. Did you feel any of this? And if so, what are your thoughts? The biggest editing thing that I'm questioning is whether or not Daemon actually said the heir for a day thing, because we don't see him say it. We only take Otto Hightower's word for it, and I am very suspicious of everything that guy says. He seems like he's constantly scheming. I do not trust him. And in the book, there's also no confirmation of whether or not he said this, because it's all hearsay. Did he say it? Did he not say it? Who ratted him out? What was the situation? Was he just agreeing with somebody? We don't know. And they left it like that in the show, I think as a nod to how the story unfolds in the book, but also potentially to plant some questions in your mind. I did not feel that way about the birth scene though. I felt like that was pretty straightforward. I'm not sure what you're talking about there, but if they keep doing these cuts, I'm just assuming that that's a reference to the book and the way that's told, and that's just left to your interpretation. I understand that House of the Dragon wants to stand as its own show, akin to, but separate from Game of Thrones. With that being said, how much do you think they will follow the book, or do you think they will try to play towards the audience and bring familiar names like a Stark and Faceless Men or Dothraki? They have said over and over again that they are going to be faithful to the book. That being said, there already are some familiar names in there. If you're watching the scene where people are pledging fealty, there's a Stark there. Lannister banners at the tournament. There are a lot of things going on that are familiar in the background. Are they going to keep them as Easter eggs, or are they going to expand on them? This season, probably more Easter eggs. Further on, I obviously don't want to spoil anything. I'm trying to keep this spoiler-free as far as the books go. Further on, as the Civil War erupts, I think we're going to see a little bit more of the world than just King's Landing. I mean, that would make sense because the show has to grow in scale, right? But I don't think this is going to be done in a fan service kind of way. I think it's going to make sense with the Targaryen history. Don't think we're going to see the Dothraki though. Do you think it was a missed opportunity not having a 2-hour premiere? It felt like, welcome back, you're comfy, now leave. That's a great question. I don't think they made a mistake. I think they could have easily overstayed their welcome. I think they needed to present a concise setup for what's about to go down, and they did that very well. Would I, as a big fan of Westeros and A Song of Ice and Fire and all of those things, would I have loved to see a 2-hour Targaryen extravaganza? Of course I would have. But you have to keep in mind that they're not only catering to people like me, they're catering to a wide audience that they lost because of how Game of Thrones ended. So I think they made the right choice here. I think 2-hour premiere could have been too big. The pacing could have been all over the place. I think they did what they needed to do to get people excited, but I wouldn't put it past them to have a grand finale that is longer than normal, or maybe in future seasons to have longer opening episodes or longer finale episodes. We'll see. They have done this for Game of Thrones, so there's reason to believe they would do this again, but I don't think this was a mistake. But with that, I'm going to wrap this video up. Who knows how long this is? I have no idea as I'm filming this. I've been filming for a long time, so we are going to end this here. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought of episode 1 of House of the Dragon. I would love to discuss it with you in the comments below. If you're going to post spoilers about the book, about things that are coming up, please post spoiler warnings. But leading up to the end of the episode and anything Game of Thrones, that is all free reign for you. So let's discuss, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye.